I've been living in this old apartment building in Chicago for over 5 years now. It's a decent-sized place. The walls are a bit thin, but the neighborhood is quiet and everything was completely normal. I liked the feeling of belonging here, knowing every creak of the stairs and the schedules of the few neighbors on my floor. To me, this was the safest place on earth, until the middle of last week, when someone finally moved into the vacant apartment right across the hall. The new neighbor was a middle-aged guy, scrawny, and he never made eye contact whenever we passed each other in the hallway. Right from his very first day, a strange noise started coming from his place. It was a steady, low hum, the unmistakable sound of a white noise machine, the kind people use to block out background noise while sleeping. But the creepy part was that he kept it running 24/7, and it was loud enough to bleed right through the hallway door and straight into my living room. At first, I told myself he was probably just a light sleeper, or worked the night shift and needed total quiet. But then, I started noticing a pattern that chilled me to the bone. That buzzing sound wasn't just random noise. Every single time I took a step inside my house, the frequency across the hall would suddenly shift, mimicking the exact rhythm of my footsteps. When I opened my fridge, the humming would pause for a second, then emit a sharp, metallic screech, exactly like a grinding chain. One night, I coughed out loud in my closed bedroom, and just 3 seconds later, the machine behind the wall shrieked into a distorted loop, perfectly imitating the exact pitch of my cough. He wasn't running that machine to sleep. He was using a high-frequency audio amplification system to intercept, spy on, and synchronize with every single little move in my life. This went on for 3 days until my head was about to explode. That morning, I decided to go over and knock on the apartment door across the hall to have a straight conversation. The neighbor opened the door just a crack, revealing a gaunt face, but his smile was completely polite. He casually explained that he was an audio engineer, testing a next-generation noise-filtering app. He said the software might have a programming bug, causing it to automatically capture and amplify sounds from the surrounding environment. He apologized repeatedly, and even gave me some sweets to make peace. His polite demeanor and the scientific-sounding explanation left me a bit confused. I half believed him, so I just nodded, accepted the apology, and went back inside. However, that very night things got exponentially worse. The buzzing sound didn't decrease at all. Instead, the volume cranked up significantly. I lay in bed, staring tiredly at the ceiling, trying to endure that splitting noise. Suddenly, my ears twinged as the machine sound across the wall shifted into a low, heavy frequency. It sounded like the ragged breathing of an exhausted man. Right against my ear through the wall, a cold shiver ran down my spine, making it impossible to stay still. I sat up with a jolt, crept into the living room, and looked through the peephole on the front door. Through the distorted lens of the fisheye peephole, I froze. My neighbor was standing right in the middle of the dark hallway. He was shirtless, wearing a pair of massive, industrial-grade noise-canceling earmuffs. His eyes stared directly at my door without blinking a single time. In his hand, he held a long shotgun microphone, pointing it straight at my door lock to capture the faintest sound inside. Panicked, I accidentally stepped back, causing the wooden floor to make a small creak. Instantly, he lunged forward and pressed his face flat against my door, separated from me by only a thin layer of wood. He began scratching his fingernails lightly against the door paint and whispered in a voice full of pure excitement, "I can hear you." The next morning, I couldn't keep my cool anymore. I ambushed him right in the hallway as he was stepping out of his apartment. I confronted him, gritting my teeth. "I know exactly what kind of sick game you were playing last night. Stay away from my door before I call the cops." He didn't have that polite smile on his face anymore. His face went completely blank, and his dead eyes locked onto me. In a raspy, ice-cold voice, he muttered, "I'm just gathering raw data." With that, he shoved my hand away and walked off. The hostility was out in the open now, completely unmasked. From that moment on, my life officially turned into a living hell. He shifted to outright psychological harassment. Every time I was about to turn off the lights and go to sleep, the buzzing sound across the wall would suddenly stop. Instead, a metal rod would slam violently against the wall over and over, making me jump out of my skin. Sometimes when I was standing in the kitchen cooking, he would be right outside in the hallway. He would use his phone speaker to sync up and play back the exact sound of my stove, followed by his mocking laugh, echoing through the front door. Crack. I was completely trapped, a prisoner in my own home. Paranoia kept me constantly looking over my shoulder. I didn't dare take a heavy step or make a single sound, knowing he was pressing his ear against the wall next door. The point of no return happened this past Monday night. As I was sitting on my phone in absolute silence, an earth-shattering crash boomed from the front door. My neighbor was throwing his entire body weight into kicking my door repeatedly. The impact was so violent it shook the entire wall. It loosened the metal hinges and caused ceiling paint dust to flake down onto the floor. He screamed maniacally out in the hallway. "You're being too quiet. Make some noise. I need your sound." Things had spiraled completely out of my control. He had officially crossed the line from psychological harassment to direct physical violence, threatening my life. I tremblingly locked the chain latch on the door. I immediately called the building manager in a state of absolute panic. I screamed into the phone, threatening to call the police right away if they didn't intervene. 10 minutes later, the manager and a security guard arrived in the hallway. They knocked repeatedly on my neighbor's door, but there was only silence. Given the severity of the situation, the manager used the master key to force the door open. I hid behind the security guard, my heart pounding wildly as the opposite apartment door swung open. The inside of that apartment was completely empty. No tables, no chairs, no bed, no wardrobe, not a single trace of anyone actually living there. In the middle of the barren living room, there was only a massive high-power speaker nailed and mounted flush against the back of the shared wall dividing his place and my bedroom. On the floor sat a mini PC connected to the speaker, its monitor displaying an audio analysis software with a crisp green waveform running across the screen. Even more horrifying, tucked away in a blind spot behind the door, a camera cable was routed through a tiny drilled hole leading directly into my apartment's ventilation shaft. The computer screen was showing a live camera feed of my entire bed from a top-down angle. Right beneath that hidden camera stream, a line of red text was blinking. Synchronization successful. At the exact moment I saw those words, that familiar buzzing sound echoed from the speaker on the wall. But this time, the sound wasn't just coming from the other side of the wall. It began to emit synchronously from right under my bed on the other side of the wall. This story happened a few years ago, around the end of 2021. My name is Masons. At the time, my newlywed wife Chloe and I had just moved into a duplex in a newly zoned subdivision out in the suburbs. The place was pretty far from downtown, and barely anyone lived there yet. It was completely cut off from the usual hustle and bustle of the city. When the last moving truck finally rolled out, the neighborhood immediately plunged into a dead silence. The houses in this development were built far apart with massive yards. That only made the sense of isolation feel heavier than ever. Chloe was so excited about our new place. She kept raving about the modern layout of the house. Her favorite part was the smart central heating and air conditioning system that came pre-installed. Everything ran perfectly through a touchscreen panel in the kitchen or a mobile app on our phones. The setup promised total privacy and comfort for the two of us. Our duplex was split right down the middle by a thick, solid firewall in the hallway. Our neighbors on the other side were a middle-aged couple named Arthur and Evelyn on our very first afternoon. While we were still hauling cardboard boxes inside, they walked over to the shared driveway to introduce themselves. Arthur looked like an academic type, wearing round-rimmed glasses and keeping a polite smile on his face. Evelyn stood right next to him, a petite woman who seemed gentle and soft-spoken. They brought us a basket of fresh fruit and a small, handwritten welcome card. Arthur spoke in a deep, warm, incredibly friendly tone. "Welcome to the neighborhood, you two. If you ever need any help with how the house runs, just give me a shout anytime." From that brief chat, I learned that our two units only shared one technical link. There was a utility closet right in the middle of the shared wall that housed the central air return plenum and compressor units. The closet sat directly behind the master bedrooms on both sides. To keep an eye on the airflow, I set up the internal control app on my phone. The system showed detailed air pressure readings for both sides to keep the building balanced. everything started changing on our very first night sleeping there. The clock on the nightstand had just hit exactly 2 in the morning when I woke up to a strange noise. The sound was coming from right inside the metal air vent, directly above our headboard. At first, it was just a faint, rhythmic scratching sound. The sound creaked like a thin piece of metal, repeatedly scraping against the steel inside the ductwork. I held my breath, listening closely, trying to calm myself down. I figured it was just thermal expansion from the brand new pipes settling in. But a second later, a wave of cold air pushed down, bringing a deeply bizarre smell with it. It was a heavy, suffocating scent of lavender perfume. But buried deep beneath that fake floral layer was a thick, metallic tang of rusted copper. The stench hit the back of my throat, making me nauseous and instantly anxious. The next morning, as I walked out to the garage to head to work, I crossed paths with Arthur in the driveway. He was standing there alone, just staring blankly out at the empty yard. I noticed he looked exhausted, with heavy dark circles hanging under his eyes. Even so, he managed to force that same polite smile to greet me. Before I could even mention the noise from last night, Arthur proactively spoke up first. His voice was totally flat, but his eyes darted nervously to the side. "Oh, if you don't see Evelyn around for the next few weeks, don't think anything of it. She had to rush out of state on a sudden business trip to take care of some family matters." That terrifying scratching noise, along with the scent of lavender perfume mixed with the metallic tang of rusted copper, kept repeating exactly at 2 in the morning every single night. It was like a twisted alarm clock that never missed its mark. Chloe started suffering from severe headaches and fell into a state of chronic insomnia. Her health deteriorated noticeably after just a few short days. Anxiety was written all over my wife's pale face. I decided to open the internal air management app on my phone to check the system. The technical chart showed a massive anomaly that I could not explain. The air pressure and flow from Arthur's side of the duplex had been blocked at a fixed position for the past 2 weeks. Oddly enough, the central compressor on his side was always running at full blast. Their power consumption skyrocketed, but the air wasn't circulating normally at all. Arthur's behavior also started to change in a disturbing way. He no longer stood outside soaking up the sun in the shared yard, or proactively greeted us like before. Every time he caught a glimpse of me or Chloe from afar, he would immediately turn around to avoid us. If we accidentally crossed paths, his eyes would constantly dart around to look elsewhere. His previously polite smile now turned into a strained, twitching smirk. One afternoon, right when I got home from work, Chloe pulled me into the corner of the living room with a terrified look on her face. She whispered that she had heard massive noises during the day while I was out. It was the sound of something very heavy being dragged across the concrete floor, followed by thudding impacts coming from the shared utility closet. The noise was so loud that it shook the drywall right next to our bed. The next day, I proactively waited for Arthur right outside the garage. As soon as he stepped out, I walked up to strike up a conversation. Arthur spoke at a frantic pace, stammering through his words. Sweat poured down his forehead as if he were drenched, even though he was not doing any heavy labor. He constantly interrupted me and fired back questions in a rushed tone. "Have you two been sleeping well lately? Did you hear any strange noises or smell anything unusual from the ventilation system?" I stared intently at his hands, which were tightly gripping a wrench. On the back of Arthur's right hand, there were small, elongated scratches that were still oozing fresh blood. They looked exactly like fingernail scratches from a violent struggle. The conflict inside my mind began to rise to a peak. My instinct and intuition told me that something horrible was happening right on the other side of the wall. But the polite habits and hesitation of a suburban resident held me back. I reassured myself that I should not pry into a neighbor's private life without concrete evidence. I chose to stay silent, and that was the biggest mistake of my life. Our endurance finally hit its limit on the 15th night. Exactly at 2 in the morning, the series of scratching noises inside the air vent suddenly rang out. But this time, it was no longer faint like the previous nights. The sound became frantic, powerful, and incredibly deafening. It sounded as if something metallic was intentionally slamming hard against the spinning iron blades of the vent fan to grab our attention. The violent rattling of the iron duct echoed through the dead silence of the bedroom. Chloe completely panicked and burst into tears. She covered her ears tightly with both hands and screamed in helplessness. "I can't take this anymore, Mason. That foul stench is killing me." I could smell the metallic tang of rusted copper mixed with lavender, which had now grown so thick and concentrated that it made me gag. It smelled like a graveyard wrapped tightly inside a plastic bag. My fear transformed into an intense rage and sheer determination. I knew I could no longer pretend that nothing was wrong. I got out of bed and went to grab a screwdriver, along with a high-powered, ultra-bright flashlight. I climbed onto the headboard and began to unscrew every single bolt on the metal grill covering the air vent. When the metal grill dropped, a blast of freezing, foul air hit me straight in the face. I clenched my teeth to keep from vomiting all over the bed. I pressed the button to click the flashlight on, then shone the powerful beam of light directly into the deep, pitch-black void of the air duct. This duct led straight toward the shared utility closet, nested between our two houses. The powerful beam of light from my flashlight pierced through the incredibly long air duct. It shone directly into the deep darkness of the central air return plenum. Nested deep inside the shared wall, the exact moment the light hit the other end, that horrific scratching sound rang out again. My heart skipped a beat as I witnessed the scene right before my eyes. It was not a system error, and it was not caused by any animal either. Appearing under the flashlight beam was a pale and gray human hand. The fingers were frozen rigid in a contorted grip. That hand was being pulled up and pushed down repeatedly by the powerful suction of the ventilation fan. A gold wedding band sat on the ring finger of that hand. Every time the airflow pushed hard, the wedding ring repeatedly slammed against the spinning iron blades of the fan. That mechanical clashing was exactly what created the chilling scratching noise at 2 every single night. A horrifying and brutal truth was fully exposed right in front of me. Arthur had never sent his wife out of state on a business trip like he said. He had murdered Evelyn and stuffed her corpse right inside the air return plenum located in the shared utility closet between the two houses. He took advantage of the constant flow of cold air from the air conditioning system to preserve and freeze his wife's body. He did this to delay the decomposition of the body in order to hide his crime. And that heavy lavender perfume scent we smelled every night was intentionally sprayed by him directly into the air duct. He tried to use that artificial fragrance to mask the overpowering stench of death during the first few days after the murder. I stood frozen on the headboard, my entire body shaking with terror, before I could even gather my wits to step back. A dark shadow suddenly appeared from the other side of the duct. That shadow completely blocked the beam of my flashlight. Through the narrow gap of the deep pipe, I was horrified to see Arthur's face. He was pressing his eye right against the duct, staring back at me with a bone-chilling gaze. He knew I had seen everything. Instantly, a loud, dry click echoed from the shared wall of the two houses. The entire power system and the air conditioning on my side of the duplex immediately cut out completely. The bedroom space was plunged into a dark and silent night. Utter terror squeezed my chest as I realized another fact. Arthur not only knew I had discovered his secret, but he was also holding the key to the shared utility closet. That closet had a door leading straight into the inside of our house. In the dead, freezing darkness, I screamed out for Chloe. "Chloe, run to the front door right now." My scream ripped through the terrifying silence of the house. My wife panicked and bolted up from the bed in pitch blackness. I grabbed her hand and we both sprinted desperately toward the front door. I used every ounce of my strength to throw the door open and run out into the yard. We dove into our car parked in the shared driveway. I immediately hit the lock button to secure all the car doors. My hands shook violently as I picked up my phone to dial 911. I spoke in breathless, choking gasps to the dispatcher on duty. "I want to report a horrific murder at a suburban duplex. The neighbor killed someone, and he is trying to attack my wife and me." About 5 minutes later, police sirens echoed through the sparsely populated area. Red and blue lights from multiple patrol cars flashed continuously across the house walls. Heavily armed police officers quickly rushed inside the duplex. Just a few minutes later, they escorted Arthur out in tight handcuffs. His face was completely blank and showed absolutely no remorse. An officer approached our car to update us on the situation inside. He said Arthur had pried open the utility closet door and sneaked into my house earlier. He was hiding right behind the dark kitchen door, with a large hammer in his hand. If we had run down to the kitchen instead of the front door, we probably would not have survived. The rescue team and forensics quickly pried open the air return plenum in the shared utility closet. They pulled out Evelyn's frozen body right in front of my traumatized wife and me. I saw her face was ash gray and coated in a freezing frost from the air conditioner. We broke our lease on that house that very same horrific night. We chose to lose our entire massive deposit just to escape that godforsaken place as soon as possible. We packed a few essential clothes and moved straight into an apartment downtown. That place always had bright lights and plenty of people walking around to give us a sense of security. However, the severe psychological toll lingered for many years for both of us, to this very day. Whenever I walk into a room and hear the air conditioning kick on, I flinch in terror. Cold sweat automatically breaks out down my spine when the cool air pours down from the ceiling. The creaking sound of that wedding ring, slamming against the iron fan blades in the dark, remains the most haunting sound of my life. It is a chilling reminder that behind the polite smiles of your neighbors, there could be a bloodthirsty monster. There are things that happened years ago, but whenever night falls, I still wake up with a sudden chill running down my spine. This story happened a few years ago, when I had just turned 24 and moved into a small, old wooden attic apartment on the outskirts of chilly Boston. It was a small, isolated house, surrounded by dense trees that were completely bare of leaves in the winter. The attic space was clumsily split down the middle by a thin wooden partition wall. I rented the left side and the right side belonged to another man. The landlord told me that he was a private guy who kept to himself and worked nights. During the entire time I lived there, I never once saw his face, and we never even crossed paths in the shared entryway. To me at the time, my neighbor's presence was just a vague concept, an invisible existence right on the other side of my bedroom's wooden wall. My bedroom was on the top floor, and my bed was pressed right against the wall, separating the two apartments. Because the wooden partition was so thin, sometimes, when the space was completely quiet, I could hear faint movements from the other side. But in a place like this, hearing noises from a neighbor was completely expected, so I didn't think twice about it. Back then, my life revolved around an exhausting, grueling routine. I worked long hours starting from early in the morning, and came home late at night completely drained and exhausted. I only had enough energy to cook a simple meal, eat quickly, and go straight to bed to get ready for the next shift tomorrow. My mind was always blank and tired. Even though the house was a bit old and drafty, I still felt incredibly happy and proud to finally have a private space. A place that completely belonged to me. That false sense of freedom completely blinded me to the basic safety precautions I should have taken, making me fail to realize just how thin the boundary was between myself and a dangerous stranger. The protective function of this house was flawed right from the start, and I had completely let my guard down. The first week passed in a state of false peace. But then, late one night, everything began to change. I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone in the pitch-black silence of the attic. All of a sudden, a strange sequence of noises came from the other side of the wooden wall, right next to the head of my bed. It was a faint scratching, a rustling sound that sounded exactly like fingernails slowly dragging across the rough wooden surface. Right after the scratching came the muffled mumbling of a man. But that voice was not normal at all. It had an incredibly high pitch, squeaky and strangled in a bizarre way, like someone intentionally faking a voice or being choked. The sound was low and indistinct, but because the wall was so thin, it felt like the person was standing right next to me, whispering. I couldn't understand a single thing he was saying. It was just a series of nonsense words repeated over and over again. My body instantly froze up, my heart skipping a beat in the dark. I tried to reassure myself that maybe he was talking on the phone with someone, or it was just the sound of a TV left on low volume. I tried to ignore it, closing my eyes tight and forcing myself to sleep so I could get to work early the next day. After a while, that twisted, creepy mumbling finally stopped. A few nights later, that sick sound showed up once again. This time, the sound was clearer, louder, and went on continuously without stopping. I couldn't take it anymore, so I sat up and pressed my ear right against the cool surface of the wooden wall to listen closely. I realized a terrifying truth. He wasn't on the phone at all. He was talking to himself in that breathy, childlike voice. The initial discomfort I felt completely turned into a genuine, spine-chilling dread. The next morning when the sun came up, the nighttime fear seemed to fade, and I started lying to myself again. I blamed my exhaustion and work stress for making my mind overly sensitive and paranoid. I figured the neighbor might just be a mentally unstable but harmless guy, and I didn't want to make a big deal out of it with the landlord without clear evidence. By the following night, to escape this terrible reality, I turned on a box fan at its highest setting and put on noise-canceling headphones. I used those artificial sounds to build a safe bubble for myself. I tried hard not to think about the fact that an unstable, completely abnormal person was just a few steps away from me, separated by a single, thin layer of wood. My tolerance was pushed to a new limit in the middle of that week, just as I took off my headphones to turn over and go to sleep. A sound cut through the silence. Those were two distinct knocks made with the back of a hand. Coming from the other side of the wooden wall, right next to the head of my bed, I started and sat straight up, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would jump out of my chest. The attic room fell into a dead silence for a few seconds, cold and suffocating. Then, at that exact same spot, two more identical knocks rang out with the exact same rhythm as before. The person on the other side of the wooden wall hadn't just accidentally brushed their hand against it. He knew exactly where I was lying. A deep sense of dread welled up inside me as I realized this was an intentional interaction directed at my presence. The next night, things got even worse than that. After 3 slow, heavy knocks, a breathy voice came through the thin wooden grain. That voice was muffled, twisted, and so chilling that it made my entire body freeze up. "What are you doing in there?" The sentence was short but perfectly clear word for word, completely shattering all my previous harmless self-reassurances. He knew I was awake, he knew I was very close to him, and he was directly confronting me, in a state of sheer panic. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand with trembling hands and called my best friend right away. I burst into tears, sobbing and whispering into the phone brokenly, begging him to come over immediately. My friend drove through the night to the apartment and decided to stay over on the living room sofa to keep watch for me. His presence gave me back a small sense of safety, and the rest of the night passed in a state of false silence. For the next 3 days, the neighbor's apartment was completely dead quiet. There was no more scratching or rustling, no more knocking on the wall, and no more sick voices echoing through. But this silence didn't make me feel relieved at all. Instead, it began to drive my mind crazy. I started to panic and question my own sanity. I wondered if the immense work stress had made me paranoid and caused me to imagine the whole thing. My guard slowly dropped during those quiet days. I told myself that maybe everything was truly over and the neighbor had given up on his twisted little game. That night, a massive storm hit the city, with torrential rain pounding relentlessly against the tin roof and dry branches scratching sharply against the window. I was fast asleep after an exhausting day of work when I was suddenly snapped awake by a rapid sequence of sounds. It was a violent, continuous scratching right next to my ear, a sound that felt exactly like human fingernails trying their best to claw through the wooden grain to get inside. Pure terror mixed with a long-repressed anger made me lose all control. I sat straight up, gathered every ounce of courage in me, and screamed at the wall in front of me. "Please, just leave me alone. I'm calling the police right now." The attic room suddenly froze for a few seconds. The scratching vanished, leaving only the sound of the rain pattering outside. And then, instantly, a deep, cold voice cut through the dark from the corner of my bedroom, just a few feet away from my bed. "Go to sleep." Every single blood vessel in my body froze, and my scalp went completely numb with horror. That was not the muffled, distorted voice coming from behind the wooden partition. He was right here inside my room. I let out a blood-curdling scream, a primal cry for survival, and bolted out of bed into the darkness without thinking. I ran headlong through the pitch-black hallway, flew down the steep attic stairs, and through the front door wide open. I ran barefoot into the middle of the rain-soaked street. The bone-chilling cold of the Boston winter night meant nothing to me, compared to the sheer dread of being chased from behind. I screamed for help at the top of my lungs like a madman, constantly looking over my shoulder because I expected him to be holding a knife, chasing me down. I ran for 2 whole blocks until I caught sight of a porch light from a house down the road and slammed against the door repeatedly. A middle-aged man opened the door with a bewildered look, completely startled by my disheveled, soaking wet, and utterly terrified appearance. I sobbed and begged him to let me borrow his phone to call my boyfriend, but he looked at me and said, "By the sound of it, I think we need to call the police right now." The police showed up 15 minutes later with 2 patrol cars, their flashing lights illuminating the entire street. They escorted me back to the attic apartment, and the front door was still wide open, exactly how I had left it when I fled. 2 officers drew their weapons, clicked on their flashlights, and stepped inside to search while I stood shivering in the entryway. After 10 minutes of checking every single corner, every closet, and the space under the bed, they walked out with sympathetic looks on their faces. They concluded that there was not a single soul inside my apartment, and all the windows and doors showed absolutely no signs of forced entry or break-in from the outside. I insisted that I had heard the voice right inside the room, so the officers went over to knock on the neighbor's door on the right, but the apartment next door was completely pitch black, without a single sound responding, and everything drowned in a chilling, heavy silence. I never, ever went back to sleep in that attic apartment for a single second after that terrifying night. That very night, I packed a few essential clothes and immediately moved in with my parents for the time being. My spirit completely broken and in a state of sheer panic, the fear of the dark clung to me like a ghost, making it impossible for me to close my eyes and sleep unless every single light in my room was turned on. The next morning, I called my landlord while crying and choking back tears, my voice trembling as I demanded to terminate the lease agreement immediately. I emphasized that I was willing to forfeit my entire security deposit and pay any lease-breaking penalties as long as I could be freed from that place. The landlord was very annoyed at first, repeatedly grumbling about the complicated paperwork and demanding that I give a 1-month notice according to the law. But seeing my absolute, life-or-death stubbornness and my utter panic, he realized the severity of the situation and finally agreed to let me break the lease during the days that followed. I only dared to return to the attic apartment to pack up my belongings during the daytime when my dad and my best friend were with me. I absolutely never stepped foot inside that space alone, not even in the bright middle of the day. While packing, I noticed that the neighbor's old car was still parked silently in the shared driveway, and a few dust-covered packages were still sitting untouched in front of his door. We tried knocking on his door multiple times to demand an explanation, but the apartment gave absolutely no response. His invisible presence felt like a shadowy force standing behind that blurry window curtain, watching our every move. About 3 weeks after I had settled into my new place, my old landlord unexpectedly sent me a short text message. He informed me that the neighbor in the right half of the attic had also quietly moved out in the dead of night. Without leaving any explanation or a forwarding address, I have spent a lot of time trying to look for logical reasons to explain what happened that night. I wondered if he possessed a master key to slip into my room, or if there was some hidden passageway between the 2 apartments, behind those old wooden partition walls that the naked eye couldn't see. But all of those theories will forever remain without a single confirmed answer. This story has ended, but the lingering nightmare stays with me to this very day. Whenever night falls, just hearing a very faint, unfamiliar noise in the house makes my heart race and my whole body go cold. I will have to live the rest of my life with a terrifying, open-ended question. That night, how did the man standing in the darkness of my room get in? And how long had he been staring at me before he spoke?